Welcome back. When you think about the industries that digitalization has most impacted upon, fashion is probably not the first that springs to mind. However, with the rising use of smart materials and the ability to now design your own clothes online, it can be argued that the link between fashion and technology is now stronger than ever. Today on Lokad TV, we're delighted to be joined by Madeleine Czigler, a journalist, TV producer and professor at the American University of Paris, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the link between digitalization and fashion. So Madeleine, thanks very much for joining us today. It sounds like you've got a very sort of varied background, so perhaps you should start by maybe just sort of telling us a bit more about this.
Sure. Well, I can tell you that from babyhood on, I've been in the fashion industry because my father was in textiles and then in knitwear. So from the age of 10 on, I really knew what was going on in the fashion industry. Became a journalist. I went to the University of Toronto, became a journalist with Canadian Broadcasting, and covered news and current affairs for about 15 years. And then when I moved to Paris, CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, started an all-news channel. And in order to do all news, you have to feed the beast with content. So they asked me to start covering fashion shows. And so I started to cover fashion shows in Paris in 1989. And the first fashion show they sent me to, I didn't know much about any of this because I was in politics. It was John Galliano's first show in Paris, and John Galliano is right now a legendary name in fashion. So that was the first show I covered, and for the next 20 years, I was a Paris-based producer and European producer for a show called Fashion File, which had tremendous success on the All News channel and was sold to 200 countries around the world. And I worked with a man called Tim Blanks, who's still very much in the fashion field. He's with the business of fashion. And we had a lot of fun covering hundreds of shows, mostly in Paris, but also in Milan, London, you name it. And the show folded in 2009. And since then, I freelanced. I started to do a lot of cultural documentaries, and then the American University of Paris asked me to start teaching the students fashion journalism. And from then, it morphed into more of a job where I am head of the fashion track, and I teach fashion history, fashion business, fashion system, and journalism.
Okay, great. Okay. Sounds quite a life. You get to travel around, going to sort of catwalk sort of shows around the world.
Yeah.
And of course, joined by Johannes. It's probably going to be a little bit out of our expertise, some of this sort of high fashion, but we're going to be talking a bit about sort of the digitalization of the fashion world. So kind of what's your initial take on this?
I mean, my take is that indeed for a long time, people were thinking that it was, I would say there were some domains that were literally unapproachable by the machines. I mean, we at Lokad, we are a software company and we try to deliver value through, I would say, smart analytics. And there are some domains where it's easier than others. Obviously, if you're selling, let's say, food in an hypermarket, you have tons of products, high velocity. It's easier to apply statistics. When it comes to fashion, I mean, you think a typical fashion store, a product is only going to be sold something like once a month. So it becomes much more difficult to think of statistics because what statistics needs is certain volume of data. So that's, if you want to start, and things start to be very sparse. Also, there is the fact that in fashion you can have nearly endless combination. You have so many variables. A shoe, you have obviously the size, but you have the heel height, the material, the color, the shade. You have probably something about 200 parameters to completely characterize, a typical shoe. And but if you look at the sales history, even of a large, a large brand, they are only going to sell a couple of thousands of units per type of shoes, down to the latest SKU. So it's not gigantic numbers. So it was, I believe, that was making the field very challenging. And so for a long time, I think that people were not looking at that much. But what is interesting is that with the advent, I would say, of the online fashion trends, the influence on the internet that pushed them more toward e-commerce, and digitalization. So it didn't start with I believe in fashion with smart analytics. It started with basically fashion blogs and sort of things that brought them to a more digital world, no analytics involved. But then they started to have a lot more data, visits on web pages, etc. And now, for the last year, Lokad, we are seeing quite a lot of traction of actually fashion brands that are coming to us, inquiring about the possibility to optimize prices, quantities, and the latest development in statistics are actually more capable of dealing with this sparse data. So there is, a combination of interests that are only coming now, but also with classes of statistical tools that can work with less data, which is critical in fashion, because again, you're not selling like thousands of units a day on a store.
Yeah. So Madeleine, there's a lot of sort of digital tools out there in the sort of fashion world. What do you see as being the most important out of these tools?
Well, because I'm in communications, I think you're absolutely right, Johannes. It's all about how you're communicating your product. And right now, it used to be blogs, but now it's Facebook and Instagram. Instagram is God. So Instagram right now is the leading digital tool that fashion uses in order to market their products. And the interesting thing with Instagram is that it's not necessarily a brand-based entity, but it uses individuals to sell product, okay?
So you're talking about sort of influencers and social
Absolutely.
media influencers.
This is the age of influencers, It's totally bewildering to big companies here in Paris, Dior and the rest, because how do we determine who is the person who will sell my product best, who will message my product best? So this is a huge challenge for them.
And from a kind of a Lokad perspective, how can you use Instagram? Is that something sort of statistically that's of interest to us, or?
Ultimately, yes. But right now, because fashion companies have not been, delving much into their data, we typically advise to start with the transactional data. So it's first you start, it goes in circle. First you start with the data that is very limited but very reliable, like your sales, your stock, your prices, the price of competitors, to have proper description of your products so that you have all the attributes so that you know your products correctly, instead of just having the thing in the head of very talented people, but it's not necessarily super shared inside the organization. And then as you progress through, I would say, concentric circles of data, you would probably first start with the core, which is the transactional data, then extend to probably competitive intelligence, where you're just looking at what are the competitors offering, because it's easier to grab this data as compared to, I would say, social media. And then once you're done with that, you go with social media. And just to give you an idea, every time you go from one circle to another, you're probably going to have like 100 times more data. So you start with your transactional core. If you go into competitive intelligence, that's like 100 times more data. And if you go to social media, it's probably going to be above 100 times more data. So the challenge becomes very technical very fast, because processing a couple of gigabytes of sales history is relatively easy-ish nowadays. But processing petabytes of images and video streams from a gigantic social media platform like Instagram, it's very much a challenge.
Okay. And how has social media kind of impacted journalism? I mean, that's where you had a real sort of background.
Yes.
Is that an area that's been completely reshaped by digitalization?
Well, it's all over the map, really. I would say it's like the Gutenberg revolution, I studied under Marshall McLuhan in Toronto,
Okay.
and he was a firm believer that technology is what drives society and what drives our lives, really. So right now we're undergoing this unbelievable technological revolution, which of course impacts the field I'm in. First of all, television is having a hard time. surviving because of all the other streaming services that you can do via the internet. You can watch via the internet. But I would say the print is really undergoing a huge upheaval, to the point where, of course, advertisers are leaving en masse print media and going into digital media, where they're not even sure whether or not they're very impactful. That's another question, right?
Yeah.
But be that as it may, the New York Times, the Guardian, all of them have to have very multidimensional ways of really gaining their livelihood.
Yeah.
And Johannes, let's talk a bit maybe about sort of some of the advances in technology. What are the real sort of advances in technology that digitalization has really given us access to, and how's that affected the fashion industry?
I mean, it's interesting because you see, if we take the old world that you just presented, for those fashion companies, they could operate in a very top-down fashion, in the sense that if you had some mass media, TVs, newspapers that were, that had the audience captive, that meant that you could have a very top-down approach where you say, here is my marketing plan, the list of products that I'm going to mass market, and execute that plan. And thus for us, I would say supply chain people, that was about, say, okay, the marketing is going to push this amount of budget on TV, on other channels with source products, so we can forecast that there will be a corresponding demand and execute on that. And I would say fast forward, 50 years later compared to, the emergence of TV, now you have things that are, as you just presented, way much more multidimensional. Also much more diverse, because the age of influencers mean that instead of having 4 main national TV channels that you could discuss with, suddenly you have like 10,000 influencers who have wax and wine each one of them, and where you don't have the same degree of control. Usually you can't just, it's not like a TV where you can say, I'm going to buy slots on your blog. They might not be willing to do that. They might have firm belief on what they want to push or not push and whatnot. So suddenly it becomes a lot more fuzzy. So the way I see that is that first, in terms of tech, is that we change from having tech to basically execute s&op, sales and operation plan with big top-down vision, to something that is maybe less ambition, but just cope with the ongoing noise. But from our perspective of, I would say, supply chain, I think that the analytics start to emerge to be able to apprehend this sort of new world where you have less control, where there is a lot more noise, and also where people expect to operate much faster. That's this idea of capturing the latest trend. At some point, if you can't predict the latest trend, it becomes a matter of how can you, act and deliver something that fits in a matter of weeks, super fast.
So let's go sort of build on that. Madeleine, perhaps maybe how do you sort of see the future?
It's absolutely about speed.
Yeah.
And that's where big companies like Inditex have a huge advantage, because they're vertically integrated. They don't have to go out to get their products. They see a trend, they work on it, in 2 weeks it's in the store, right? So really to behave in this speedy manner, it's a huge challenge for a smaller enterprise or somebody who's trying to break into the field. And hence, there's this upside down trend where you do start communicating before you even producing. You communicate your brand, like Miss Weiss, Into the Gloss, who 10 years ago, a little Vogue model, editor, starts doing a little makeup blog called Into the Gloss. She had hundreds of thousands of followers, very clever cookie. She works from 4 till 8 in the morning every day to do her own business, figures out, goes and tries to get seed money, gets a few $1 million together, and starts producing 4 products. And those 4 products in 5 years have morphed into over a $1 billion company. So she started with communicating her own pretty face and her ideas, and then the product came after.
Yes.
You see?
And we spoke a bit about it before, maybe on Lokad TV, but it's that super fast fashion where you've got sort of lead times of sort of 2 weeks from sort of concept to it actually being on the shelves. I mean, what supply chain challenges does that kind of introduce?
Tons of them. I mean, first, it's hard to produce in Bangladesh if you want to have like 2 weeks lead time. So you need to bring it a lot closer, which is more expensive. But also, it's funny because, you know, in terms of tech, we have now completely automated factories for cars, which are very complicated products. You know, I think nowadays an average car has like 60 processors in there. I mean, it's like a technological marvel, super complicated. But it's funny because in fashion, doing a knot, you know, on a piece of clothing is extremely hard to automate. But the tech is gradually getting there, and those things that were extremely labor intensive go very incrementally, but we are getting to, I would say, satisfying degree of automation when it comes to just sewing and cutting textile, which is very, very difficult. Even if it doesn't look like super high tech, it actually is a massive industrial challenge. And thus, I think what I'm seeing, I would say, for the next decade is that with better automation, plus maybe a willingness to put a bit more money on the production side, there will be, you know, I would say companies, brands will actually bring some of the production closer, I guess. And that's probably one of the first key to enable, you know, a faster fashion. I think the second constraint, so that if you bring the production closer, second constraint is to change the very organization so that they can have, I would say, swift product delivery. Because too frequently, for example, when we started working with clients, they tell us, oh, we have 4 collections a year. But if you have 4 collections a year, that means that pretty much by design, you're maybe 1.5 months or something behind whatever is the latest trend. You know, just because you're working on a schedule and your schedule goes by quarter after quarter. So if you want to be super, super flexible, then you kind of have to give up to those, you know, collection-driven organization.
Yes.
And that requires, you know, and our clients frequently, they were entirely organized around this idea of having a fixed number of collection being pushed every year. And I think with better software tools, they can think of dropping new products like every week, but it's a massive challenge because it's like all the old practices are kind of out of whack. You know, you need to communicate completely differently with your suppliers. You need to completely communicate differently with your retail chain or your stores if you have them extra. So it's Lokad, we can help them, I would say, on the software side, but there is so many practices to reinvent that are just beyond what we do.
Yeah. And we've spoken a lot about sort of this new world of fashion and how it's sort of going forward. I mean, what can you teach your students that's still going to be relevant in sort of 20 years' time?
Well, it's very much Johannes's philosophy. You have to ground yourself. You know, you understand the business, you start from the ground up. What I teach is really the basics of journalism to my students, first of all, in fashion journalism, who, what, where, when, why, and go from there. The tools change nonstop, but you have to have the basic knowledge and skill in order to transmit your knowledge via these tools. So that does not frighten me. And what I love teaching students is that they teach me as much as I teach them. And I teach both grads and undergrads, and sometimes I ask the grad students about a tool. And they would say, they're 24 years old, they say to me, ask the 20-year-olds, because we don't know, you know? So it's going that fast. So as far as I'm concerned, it really is about the basics. I mean, I believe they have to know the history, they have to know the names in fashion, they have to know the whole fashion system, how it's done. And after that, they can do whatever they want with that knowledge, with whatever tool they deem fit, you know, to communicate with.
Yeah, I mean, I know how that is. I had Johannes telling me I was too old the other day because I still use a laptop, which is now old, apparently. There's a lot of negative press around sort of this fast fashion and its kind of impact on sort of the environment and things like that. I mean, how can we overcome some of these sort of negative sort of impacts of maybe digitalization and fast fashion and things like that?
I mean, First of all, I don't think the impact on the environment of fashion is that large. I mean, there's many things. People. That's very funny because people tend to forget the orders of magnitude. For example, I know that in France, 90% of the waste that we produce comes from the construction industry. So, because indeed, building a house and tearing down is going to generate literally tenth of tons of waste, which is way more than all the cloth that you're going to wear in your entire life. Furthermore, most of the clothes that we have, it's cotton. It's actually fairly biological products, so that they can be degraded and recycled fairly easily. So I do not see that as a major problem. But it's very funny. It's because fashion is so prominent in the news that it tend to attract a lot of attention. And that was very funny because there was another industry who was having the same sort of problems, which was I would say consumer electronics with smartphones, and people were saying, think of all those millions of smartphones that you're going to recycle. Yes, a smartphone is something like 150 grams of plastics. You're probably, if you drive 20 kilometers with your car, you're going to burn a lot more oil than 150 grams of plastic. And again, the gasoline that you burn in your car is not that different in terms of as a chemical than what you have in your smartphone. So bottom line is that I think it's in terms of supply chain, it's very important to not, I would say, to not lose sight of the orders of magnitude of the problems that you're dealing with. A more, I would say, probably interesting and challenging problems is probably the fact that some companies in the textile industry, not just fashion, but broadly textile industry, are sourcing, I would say, manpower from countries that are the cheapest on the planet, and that comes with tons of, ethical challenges. In a way, I mean, people criticize that, people say, you produce in Bangladesh, you are like a vile capitalist. But in a way, for Bangladesh, it's a tremendous opportunity to become, a textile exporter. So all is not bad. It's very good that we're pushing business to countries that are very, very poor. It will ultimately make them richer, but maybe not to the extent of having child labor or inhuman working condition or whatnot. So it's a fine balance between triggering growth into very underdeveloped countries. And I think for the textile industries, the challenge are more on this side. I would say making very sure that the suppliers of your suppliers of your suppliers, because that's the way it works. That usually it's not your suppliers; it's down the chain somewhere. That all is, I would say, ethical. That's probably one of the biggest challenge, much more than the fact that you're going to have a bit of waste of cotton that is fairly easy to recycle anyway.
Okay, so if we leave sort of the last word maybe up to you, Madeleine, what are the real sort of challenges you see for the future of the fashion industry, and how do you see them sort of being overcome?
Okay, so to answer Johannes, I really don't agree with you in the sense that it's not a vital problem, this whole. What I'm learning is that the fashion industry is the second biggest polluter on the planet because of the disposal problem. Because all the fast fashion that we use here and we put into boxes on the street, they make their way to Africa, and only about 20% of them are sold in the markets, and the rest of them are landfill.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem. What was encouraging that you said before was that because of this fast demand, the carbon footprint will be much less because you'll be producing much closer to home.
Yeah.
So that's very good. What I see really encouraging is 3D, the 3D technology. I foresee a future, I don't know how far down the line, where we'll be just like in my mother's era, where we go and get a pattern from Saint Laurent, take it home, have our little machine, choose our little material and put it through the machine, and we produce our own clothes very quickly. We won't need anybody else. We'll need the designers, we'll need the pattern makers, but it's going to go back to the old days, the slow fashion days, where you actually make your own clothes. And as for disposal, what I'm seeing too now, places like MIT are experimenting with biology and fashion. You know, mushrooms and algae that will produce textiles that will be biodegradable. So, you know, this is down the line. So it's really exciting. I find it very exciting. There's a huge challenge with fast fashion and the disposal and all that. But I think because people are getting so conscious, it's going to happen.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And but don't get me wrong. I think all industries have to do their share of efforts, you know, to be more sustainable. But from my biggest perspective is that in terms of investment, people should not mistake that there are some industries where the impact is just completely way more, I would say, that has like an orders of magnitude more impact. And there are some sort of things, for example, I believe that there is about something like 15% of the worldwide energy production that is just to produce cement. You know, that's very simple things where you can have massive impact. And even if fashion does, you know, tons of efforts, I'm relatively confident, you know, in a way, and especially when you have like valuable brands, it also means that that's a virtue of being expensive, is that people treat these sort of things with more care.
Absolutely.
So I do not see, I would say, goods from Yves Saint Laurent, you know, covering the earth just because, you know, those products are fairly expensive. So people are not going to treat them like they treat, you know, a disposable tissue anyway. So I think there is virtue in there. I believe that they are doing their fair share. And also, as we have seen, you know, with Notre Dame, it was very funny with Bernard Arnault and the others that were literally competing to do the right thing and helping to reconstruct. I think that those brands are fairly engaged, you know, in the broader problems of their time. So I'm relatively confident that, you know, they will not be lagging behind in terms of, I would say, environmental challenges, etc.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there for today.
Thank
but
you.
Yeah, thanks for your time, and it's great to hear about this sort of printing clothes at home. It's a really interesting concept.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So thanks very much for tuning in. That's everything for this week, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.